Good morning, everyone. Thank you for choosing to attend the session on unfinished business, focusing on the World Development Report from 2011. This session is convened by the Government of Australia, which the program doesn't quite reflect. But there are reasons for that which I will explain in a minute. I'm sorry that we're starting a little bit late, but there are a number of other sessions that finish at 11:30 a little further away from this room. So as you can see, people are coming into the room, but we'd better get going now. My name's Michael Wilson. I'm Assistant Secretary of the Governance and Fragility Branch in the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade of Australia, based in Canberra, formerly Head of Programs in mainland Southeast Asia for the Australian Agency for International Development, the government aid program. So I come to these issues with both a program manager and policy background. I'm delighted to welcome colleagues to the panel today. We're very fortunate to have with us a range of experts in the field and people either directly associated with the thinking that came behind the World Development Report 2011 and its themes, and those tasked with implementing its findings and philosophy. So the purpose of the discussion is really to draw on international lessons from the past decade of assistance in fragile and conflict-affected states and areas, particularly those highlighted in the 2011 World Development Report on conflict, security and development, in order to inform donor approaches to how to implement Sustainable Development Goal 16 in particular. So 5 years on, the World Development Report 2011 continues to be a useful guide. In fact, its recommendations appear, at least to those of us working on these issues in Australia, as more relevant than ever. And it has been referenced in many other sessions in this year's conference. Recent experience has shown that restoring confidence and transforming institutions of citizen security, justice and jobs have been crucial to helping end protracted cycles of weak, illegitimate institutions and violent political contestation. Donor expectations and approaches have been influenced by the report's finding that meaningful institutional change will be highly contested and non-linear, and that it might take a generation or more to achieve. The report was a highly influential one amongst major bilateral donors, including Australia. The WDR framework has been integrated into many of our programs delivered by the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, and strategies, including in Myanmar and the Philippines. Despite this influence, the impact of the report on mainstream donor practice has been mixed, particularly within the World Bank itself. While there have been pockets of success in country programs, there has been much less progress on the uptake of WDR 2011 recommendations at the policy and institutional level. Today we've asked our distinguished panellists to reflect on the key insights from this enduring report, focusing on these questions. Firstly, what are the critical lessons from WDR 2011 that challenge traditional approaches to state building and peace building? Secondly, what progress has there been to date in implementing the recommendations of WDR 2011? And finally, what changes are needed for donors to be fit for purpose in meeting the challenges of fragile and conflict-affected situations? Before I turn to our panellists to make their brief introductions to the subject. I'll set a few ground rules, if I may, for the question and answer session that will follow. We have a 1 hour session, so as you listen to the presentations, please come up with your number one best, most important question. And you will have 1 minute to ask that best, most important question before I cut you off. If you have more than one question, we may get round to you a second time, but I think in the interests of equity and keeping the discussion flowing, if we do that, we'll have a more stimulating and interactive discussion. So I'm warning you now, I'll warn you again when we get to the question and answer session. First then, I'd like to introduce Sarah Cliff, who's currently the Director of New York University's Centre on International Cooperation. She's particularly relevant to this panel because Sarah was the co-director of the WDR 2011 on conflict, security and development. She has worked for the last 20 years in countries emerging from conflict and political transition, and has held key roles in the UN and the World Bank's East Asia Pacific region. And I worked with Sarah on East Timor at a particularly challenging time when I myself was very new to the development business. So she holds a particular place in my heart. And thanks. Sarah, over to you.
Thank you, Michael. And I should say that I see in the audience at least 2 WDR members, Gary Milante and Nick Winmint. So I'm not the only member of that team who's present, and many who supported the development of the WDR. As you can hear, my voice is going a little bit, but I hope that you can still hear me through the course of this panel. I wanted to make 5 points on where I think the WDR stays very relevant conceptually, but implementation has been mixed, and then reflect very briefly on some issues I think we didn't cover in the WDR, which have become more relevant in its aftermath. So the 5 points I'll make are on legitimate institutions that produce security, justice and jobs, repeated setbacks, confidence building and inclusive enough coalitions, global and regional initiatives, and joint programming that cuts across the security, justice and economic areas. So first on legitimate institutions that produce security, justice and jobs, which was the head banner message, if you like, of the WDR. This, I think, has stayed highly relevant conceptually to the conflicts that we see going on around the world today. So the uptick in conflict that has tragically happened in the last 3 to 4 years, very much centered around conflicts in the Middle East, the legitimacy of national institutions in those countries, particularly their ability to include different populations cutting across sectarian and regional divides, their inability to guarantee security, clearly not only in the sense of capacity, but also in the sense of security institutions that are trusted by the population, no matter from what origin they come. Justice and very basic economic inclusion, in particular youth employment, remains incredibly relevant both to the triggers of those conflicts and to eventually their resolution. How have we done in terms of responding to a focus on those areas? I think the evidence at the moment is a little bit mixed. So there is certainly much more rhetorical engagement. We're seeing more country strategies that mention those areas or have them as a focus of their development goals. But overall international investment has not necessarily followed those key messages. And I would say that in particular the justice message of the WDR has tended to get lost. We see that in terms of international aid patterns. So for example, aid for the peace building and state building goals that the G7 Plus and the international dialogue adopted has actually declined in terms of investment in the justice sector in the last 4 years. But we also see it in the focus of dialogue between countries that are at risk of escalating conflict and the international community. That there still, I think, tends to be an overemphasis on the security and jobs messages of the WDR, not always as much on the legitimacy of institutions and the justice message. Second, repeated setbacks and inclusive enough coalitions. I said that a lot of the uptick in conflict comes from the Middle East, and of course it does, but not only. We have also seen the renewal of fighting in South Sudan, and in Burundi over 200,000 people are now displaced, return of mass crisis to the Great Lakes region. Those are countries where we could, I think, have been much more vigilant about predicting setbacks. South Sudan in particular was highly predictable that a newly independent state facing the kind of stresses that it faced would in fact go into a cycle of crisis, and we could have adapted more clearly our strategies to respond. I also don't think that we sent the message on the need not only to have strong national ownership but an inclusive coalition of ownership strongly enough in some of those situations and others. Third, confidence building. I always think of this in a couple of elements. One is the need for governments and leadership in countries coming out of crisis to focus quickly on some actions they can deliver that will build confidence in the population that things are going in the right direction, and also the need not to try to do everything at once. So the WDR noted that successful transitions had often focused on just 2 or 3 key confidence building results, not on doing 40 things all at the same time. So when I think of some of the countries facing transition at the moment, CAR, for instance, where the Prime Minister, I think, spoke in the opening panel of the Fragility Forum, Tunisia still coming out of the transition from authoritarian rule and the Arab Spring, Myanmar coming out of a very different background. That lesson of building confidence between governments and the population is still, I think, very key. And that also cannot be done in a whole range of areas at once. But there I think we still see 2 weaknesses on the international side. We are still quite slow to go in. CAR would be an example here. And we often don't invest at the kind of scale that is necessary for governments to really deliver that degree of confidence to their population. And we still tend to have demands that the countries must address everything at once. Myanmar here would be an example. That's a country that faces multiple different transitions and challenges going on at the same time. We, I think, have expectations that all those areas should be addressed at once, rather than that you have to go in loops of building confidence and then institutionalizing the progress that has been made. Fourth, on global and regional initiatives, the WDR pointed quite strongly to the issues which could not be controlled by any one state alone that were related to conflict, including illicit financing flows and other types of spillover. This has become more relevant in the aftermath. To me, it's very interesting to see in the SDGs that of 169 targets we have adopted, 34 of those are clearly cross-national targets. This is a very different environment from the MDGs, where really the goals were designed to be able to be implemented at a national level. It's not the case with the SDGs. We still find this challenging in the international community, where our structures are not very well geared to be able to deliver that kind of cross-border initiative. And last, on joint programming. So the WDR focused a great deal on really practical, on-the-ground level programming, which could link up those organizations which supported areas of security and peace building with those organizations that supported economic and social programming. I think that there have been some examples of this increasing. We've seen in Somalia closer relationships, in CAR to some extent some of the initial assistance was designed to be delivered in that way. But I still do not see it on the ground as a regular modus operandi. And I've been interested in my new post that I moved to, where we do quite a lot of work on linking up humanitarian and development actors, to see that the same language has become accepted as important, that you need to go beyond the rhetoric of coordination to actually having practical joint programs on the ground. So a question maybe in thinking about implementation is, why has this been so difficult to translate into practice when in fact we still see that it is needed in the kind of complexity of crisis that we face today? Let me just conclude by saying by talking about a couple of issues that we did not address. We did not address the rise in great power tensions, which has in fact been a feature of some of the conflicts of the last 5 years. So this is something, when we look ahead at the next decade, that in some areas of the world is likely to be an increasing feature of conflict, and means that you have a level of action on conflict resolution which goes beyond some of the more localized, more national, more regional actions that we focused on. Second, we did look at some analysis on violent extremism. It was obviously already a phenomenon that was preoccupying attention at the time the WDR was completed, but not at the level of depth where, if I was repeating the exercise today, I would want to look at those connections. And on violent extremism, I think it's probably quite important to note that there's a linkage which the WDR's analysis of violence and conflict doesn't deal with. And that's in particular the recruitment of quite highly educated, relatively middle-class individuals. So there are several areas of the WDR's analysis I think are relevant to violent extremism. Inclusion in institutions, I would guess, would come out as being significant, for example. But that particular issue of cross-border recruitment of middle-class educated individuals, I don't think is explained by the WDR framework. And indeed, it would be very nice to see a new bit of research which would take on that question. Let me stop here.
Wow, Sarah, that was amazing. 9 minutes. So in time and covered a lot of ground. Thank you very much. Habibu Rehman Maar is the Deputy General Secretary of the G7 Plus group of nations, engaging, among other things, in the New Deal process, and plays a leading role in the international dialogue on peace building and state building, which had its last meeting here in Washington on Monday. He leads the work on policy and advocacy and supports the G7 Plus chair and member countries in their collaboration with the development partners on issues relating to New Deal implementation. Prior to this, he served as head of the Aid Coordination Unit in the Ministry of Finance in Afghanistan, where he was responsible for managing coordination between donors and government to ensure alignment of development aid with government priorities. Over to you, Habib.
Thank you, Michael, and thank you so much. I'm honored and humbled to be on this great panel talking about this very relevant theme, and it's good to refresh our minds and our narratives, you know, after 5 years or 6 years, 5 years, I guess, when the WDR was launched. I must say that the era between 2010 and 2015 should be called as an onset towards a transformation in the aid industry, if there is something like that exists in this industry, I would say. Because of a lot of changes, you know, in the theories happened during this time. Sorry. In 2010, we had with the G7 Plus countries, which lived the experiences which are recommended in the report on a daily basis. We issued a daily declaration for the first time where we recognize the peace building and state building goals and linking security and conflict with the development. And then the end of 2011, of course, you know, the middle of 2011, we experienced the launch of the WDR, which was also a kind of supposed to be a game changer. And then the end of 2011, we agreed on an umbrella agreement, which we call New Deal for Engagement in Fragile States, that was endorsed in Busan, which formally recognized the trust and the PSGs and the focus principles in line with all the recommendations that were proposed in the WDR. And then finally in 2015, the end of 2015, the launch of SDGs, and then the goal number 16 on peace and justice and inclusive institution was another, you know, major landmark, I would say, in the international development. Now, let me briefly share my views on how the launch of WDR set our expectations at that time when I was in Afghanistan and working in the government. In 2011, when the report was launched, the government of Afghanistan was preparing to take full responsibility of its security and also development. We were finalizing 22 national priority programs, and we were negotiating with the donors because 2014 was set to be the end of the transition period where the security would be completely, handed over to the National Army and National Police of Afghanistan. During 2011, the monthly cost of only US troops in Afghanistan was estimated to be $6.7 million per month, which was around $72 billion. It doesn't include any other, the NATO troops. It was only just for the US troops. And our national budget at that time was around $4 billion, of which 50% was covered by the development partners. And of course, it didn't include the support for the national security. And while negotiating the Tokyo Mutual Accountability Framework, which was a compact between the donors and the government of Afghanistan, the government of Afghanistan was asking the donors to provide $5 to $7 billion every year through the budget, through the government budget. And the government, mentioned and reiterated its assurance that we can take full responsibility of our security, including counterinsurgency. So you can compare, $5 to $7 billion with $72 billion a year. That was our demand at that time. There was a widespread perception and, of course, a fear as well among the citizens of the country that after 2014, there might be another dooms that Afghanistan would face, because there was a perception that if the NATO forces leave, aid will decline, and then definitely when aid declines, so the government will fall, short of fiscally, it will fall short of the funds required to maintain the basic service delivery. But very interestingly, at the same time, there was an estimate, there was a kind of perception that definitely the aid will decline when the NATO troops leave the country, which in fact happened, but its impact on the economy will not be that much greater. Why? The reason was that during these 15 years or this 10 or 12 years, the development aid has very minimal impact on the economy of the country. So, I mean, the trickle-down impact of that aid was very less. And Afghanistan was going through a transition where the government had to maintain its legitimacy and to ensure its citizens that they can take full responsibility of their security. And securing that support from the international community was required to ensure that we will not trap back into the same situation or transition which happened in 1990, where after the Russians left Afghanistan, Afghanistan was left to its own fate, in the middle of all this chaos. And we were left on our own self for a decade until we faced that dismal incident of 9/11, and then the world turned its attention towards us. So those harsh memories were still fresh in the minds of people. Even if you would ask a kid who was selling vegetables what would happen after 2014, he would tell you the whole story, that aid will stop, and then we will again we'll face violence, and then security will be weak, and I don't know how we are going to fund our police to keep our security, or how will we keep funding our teachers and stuff like that. So that was the situation over there. So now you can imagine that a report like WDR with all those recommendations, which were very valid and still are valid, could set our expectations and can play a role. Now, countries affected by conflict and fragility had already evidenced and experienced these recommendations and these realities, which were proposed by the WDR, and of course, I mean, the recommendations, they came from the real life experience. Now, against this anecdote, let me tell you how would a naive citizen like me, I call myself naive because I spent like a week reading this report, 400 pages, something like that. And the more I was reading, I was really thinking that yes, of course, things are going to change. And I mean, we will see that impact in my very country. So, of course, the report, as Sarah mentioned, I mean, there were some limitations. We did not say that it was perfect, but I think at least if those recommendations were taken seriously, we would have, had a lot of changes, and we would have been able to change the mentality of the development community. First of all, the legitimacy of state institutions, which was, as the so-called head banner, is at the center of resilience, as you all know. And this was extremely significant, but I see that donors define the legitimacy using the common standards which are based on the benchmarks of the same neoliberal democracy type of things. Examples are, in Guinea-Bissau, we had the election. All the donors suspended their aid, and even there was no money for supporting the election, thanks to the government of Timor-Leste, who stepped in and they enabled that election. Then we had, the Central African Republic, again, as Sarah mentioned, we are waiting for, we are rushing, and of course, thank God that the election happened there, again, with the help of the countries like Timor-Leste, and also the development partners. But we are trying to impose the same type of democracy which is common here, in the Western world, in the developed world. Now, enhancing institutional legitimacy requires continued support, and service delivery is assumed to be a shared responsibility of NGOs and INGOs and the government. While, Somalia is now been trying to secure at least 10% or 13% of budget on aid to support their own priorities, they have been struggling it, but without a lot of success. Okay, sorry, yeah, it's gonna be. Now, the report called upon the donors to be bold and accept a degree of risks, and the cost of avoiding risk, because it's even more than taking that risk. But we have seen that, like cases of Guinea-Bissau and Somalia, still donors are, not taking that risk. Central African Republic is another fresh example. And the report was also considered to be a game changer, and this would include rethinking the purpose of engagement in fragile and conflict-affected states. To ensure fitness for purpose, the report noted that institutions would need to change their procedures, backed up by political will. And this is where we agreed in the New Deal on the trust and the focus principles. Unfortunately, since then, we have had a little success in influencing the political will. And again, Sarah knows, because she is leading on the New Deal review report, we found out that, that political will or that change has not happened yet. Donors are still fragmented in their approaches, while maintaining some unity on the technical level, not on the political level. The SDGs now provide another platform and another opportunity where we can unite ourselves, UN, World Bank, multilaterals and bilaterals on the common goals. Finally, as the report has suggested, and our countries experience it, institutional resilience take at least two decades. 2 to 3 decades, but I would say with the information technology, with advancement, it might, take 2 or 1 decade exactly. This can only happen with the continuous support of the donors. And thus, we have to evolve ourselves from the quick fix approach. We have to maintain we have to be patient with our outcomes. And then at the end, I would like to remind all of us that interventions cannot be successful without country leadership and coordinated approach, what the New Deal calls one vision and one plan. And that's, of course, a country-led and country-owned one vision, one plan. Please start with the situation and needs on the ground, and do not act based on preconceived blueprints which are conceived in the headquarters. We need to work together in our complex context to be long-term peace and security. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Habib. And thank you also for keeping brilliantly to time. Next, I'd like to introduce Thomas Parkes, who's the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade of Australia's Regional Specialist on Governance and Fragility within the Development Policy Division, but based in Bangkok. Tom has been deeply involved in DFAT's work in Myanmar and the Philippines and plays a key policy role on fragility and conflict issues. In his previous role at the Asia Foundation, Tom managed their regional conflict program and led the research program that produced the Contested Corners of Asia, Subnational Conflict and International Development Report, and Political Settlements, Implications for Development Policy and Practice paper. Tom.
Thanks, Michael. So I think many of us would agree that the WDR 2011 was one of the most influential WDRs in recent memory, and it certainly was the most influential development report on conflict and fragility in more than a decade. What I'm going to talk today about is how it's influenced both the Australian aid program as well as some of my work as Michael mentioned at the Asia Foundation. Now, Australia has integrated many of the core concepts in what we do. For example, our policy guidance on fragility and conflict, our strategies for supporting the peace process in Myanmar and the Philippines is deeply informed by the WDR, as well as our understanding of fragility in the Pacific. And in my previous role at the Asia Foundation, when I managed the research project Contested Corners of Asia, that report sought to unpack the problems around subnational conflict in Southeast Asia, which often happens in middle-income countries, and to try to encourage development assistance to change to be able to address those problems more effectively. Well, in many ways, the WDR was our core intellectual foundation for how we built that framework. And it worked beautifully in terms of even when we were talking about middle-income countries and capable states. So it's really quite a versatile framework. Now, I've often described the WDR 2011 as a realist approach to fragility and conflict. It reminds us that the process of state formation and consolidation does not come so easily, and that we need to rein in our ambitious expectations and timeframes. We need to understand the realities of countries in crisis and shape our assistance to the precise moment in that country's transition. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to make the argument that WDR has challenged many of our core assumptions about traditional state building and peace building approaches. I'm going to focus on just 4 of those areas. Many of them sort of overlap with what Sarah was mentioning before, and then close with 3 areas of unfinished business. Okay, the first is the importance of calibrating assistance to local context. So to be effective in these regions, I think experience has shown over and over that we need to understand the unique combination of internal and external stresses, the peculiarities of history, the nature of public confidence in the state and in state actors as well as non-state actors, and most importantly, the politics that prevent the necessary reforms and concessions needed to break cycles of fragility and conflict. Now, we've heard this many times before, but this really is a profound shift in the way that in international efforts and the way they're structured to address conflict and fragility. Now, best fit, in my view, is a polite way of saying that best practice no longer applies. The problem, of course, is that development is largely organized to deliver technical knowledge transfer, to deliver best practice. And I'll admit, Australia has supported many technical experts to sit in ministries or provide advice to fragile states. But luckily, we are now moving away from this model. The Budget Strengthening Initiative at ODI just recently released a very useful report, and they described sort of the process of institutional reform in fragile states. They focused on 4 different types of international roles: trusted advisor, facilitator and broker, dot joiner, and lastly, technician. But the problem, of course, is that majority of development people see themselves exclusively as technicians. If we get a few good facilitators and dot joiners, is that anything but luck? These are things that we actually need to think much more about and actually specifically recruit for. The second point is, as Sarah mentioned before, the importance of restoring confidence and the debilitating impact of lack of confidence or lack of trust. Now, one key insight was actually explained to me by Bruce Jones about a year after the release of the report. That they were actually talking in terms of restoring confidence, not so much about confidence in the government or in the state, but more about confidence in the transition or a political transition, right? Now, this is very important because it's often too much to ask for a conflict-affected people to have confidence in a government, especially if that government is controlled by a rival ethnic faction or a separate political group. But a transition process is a different matter. Perhaps it's a peace negotiation or a reform process. If it involves the key actors, if it's seen as credible, this can actually lead people to change their behavior even in the short term. So the critical question is, do people believe that their lives will actually improve as a result of this transition? Now, when we did the Contested Corners report, we looked very closely at this issue by asking people whether they thought that a credible transition was actually unfolding. And the answers had huge implications. In the absence of confidence in a transition, government reformers cannot make any progress. They cannot get past the resistance of hardline factions. They cannot convince non-state armed opposition groups and ethnic populations that they are sincere. And rivals will see any concessions or reforms with great suspicion or as opportunities to get strategic advantage. So our findings actually show that the possibilities for meaningful international support are actually shaped by this factor more than any other in subnational conflict areas. The third point was transitions out of fragility and the fact that they are very political and highly linear. Now, while the P word wasn't used all that frequently in the document, we actually see the implications of the report as extremely political in terms of what the arguments that were being made. Now, just in the last year, we've seen major setbacks in Asia in terms of the Myanmar and the Philippines peace processes, but yet we've seen new progress in Nepal and Sri Lanka. So the spiraling exit path is a poignant visual reminder to those of us who work on these things that this is absolutely true. Now, the concept of transforming institutions is particularly political. Now, in the Contested Corners report, we distinguish between development outcomes and transformative outcomes. Transformative outcomes, we argued, were ones that directly address the institutional drivers of conflict. These are much, much harder to address than development outcomes. Transformational change requires challenging long-term status quos. It requires threatening key major powerful actors in many contexts. And in many ways, the fact that these are so hard to address is the single best explanation for why, at least in Asia, subnational conflicts last so long. Basically, by our estimation, it was more than 40 years. So the Australian aid program has adopted many of these ideas into our programming. For example, with inclusive enough coalitions, we very specifically try to integrate this into what we do. For example, in Myanmar, our support for the Joint Peace Fund and our role in the design of that. This is a fund that is designed to bring together government reformers, as well as ethnic leaders and the donors to shape what will be a very flexible fund to support the peace process. Similarly, in Mindanao, we're in the process of designing a new education project that will be shaped by moral leaders, government, both autonomous government, central government, and other actors. So really trying to take this point to heart. And the last point is a need to adjust expectations and timeframes, the whole "it takes a generation" bit. Now, in many ways, this was the most jarring finding, and in many ways, it has not been fully internalized by most development actors. Now, the famous table, I even remember the page number on page 109, and I can't tell you how many times I've used this in presentations, shows basically the time that it takes for transformation of key governance sectors, right? The whole 27 years for control of corruption, 41 years for rule of law. But if you look at the top of that column, it said the fastest 20, right? So what happened to the slowest 20, right? And I've heard the backstory on this, but which I won't go into right now. But look, we also, to sort of answer this question, we asked GSDRC to look into a question recently. Basically, when do bureaucracies that are in sort of long-term processes of deterioration or decline, when do they actually turn around? Like what does it take to turn around a civil service that's been declining for some time? The findings were fascinating and very bleak. Most cases of renewal of a civil service tends to happen in authoritarian or highly centralized regimes. In fragmented political contexts or weak central regimes, in fact, it's very hard to find a case of when a civil service has actually turned the corner. And in fact, it's plausible that some countries, some including in our region, may actually be on long-term trajectories of decline. So they'll never reach sort of that next level of bureaucratic functioning. So these are things that concern us. Thanks, Michael. Okay, just to wrap up, a few points of unfinished business for the WDR. Absolutely agree with Habib that some of the recommendations on internal donor agency reforms are still apply, and we absolutely need to address them. The need for more sophisticated risk assessments that also consider the risk of inaction, for example. The greater acceptance of failure, more modest goals and expectations, and more incentives for staff to live, work, and engage in fragile states and conflict areas. These are very, very challenging for us to address. We can go into a long discussion about why that hasn't happened as quickly as we'd like, but they still need to be addressed. There's still also a need to move away from business as usual in a lot of these places. The spend imperatives, the results agenda, the common business processes, now these really should not apply, or they should be significantly modified in fragile states. So there's a lot of work to be done there. And then, last point, a particular interest of ours is the need to work more politically. Now, let me put this in very quickly into the WDR context. Just as an example, there are still huge challenges in donors being able to support government reformers who are trying to restore confidence. For example, sending signals or working to build more inclusive enough coalitions. In many cases, these activities don't have any obvious or direct development benefits. They actually go directly against best practice, right? Yet if they help us to restore confidence, they can lead to a breakthrough. So we have to be given the space to justify programs, even if we're not going to see anything, tangible coming out of them, particularly in cases where the symbolism of a project may actually be much more important than the development outcomes. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Tom. Again, moving straight on. Alexander Mark is the World Bank's Chief Technical Specialist on Fragility, Conflict and Violence. He has over 2 decades of experience working in areas related to conflict and violence in the Middle East, Latin America, Europe and East Asia. At the World Bank, he previously led the Social Cohesion and Violence Prevention Team and managed post-conflict reconstruction programs in Eastern Europe. Alexandre.
Thank you very much. So it's a bit difficult to come as the last one when you have so many experts, especially the author themselves, talking about their books, right? But one thing, maybe I'll take a twist of more the sort of practitioners who takes his Bible on every mission, because I think the WDR, for someone who's very secular, is the closest to the Bible that I have been using, and I always make sure I have it in my missions on my computer, sometimes with me, because in the paper we write in the aide-mémoire and all that, we always have a mention, and that's not because I'm at heart an ideologist, right? I'm not, but because there's actually really, really relevant facts in very, very different situations. I was 2 weeks ago in Tunisia, and there's a table in the WDR that is really interesting. I never understood how it was produced, but it makes a lot of effect, is the time that it takes for institution to change. Gary tried to explain to me many times, and I still don't get it, but it's very impressive. And it tells you basically, don't expect Tunisia to turn around their institution in 6 months. It's never going to happen, because it never happened to any country. So try to think how you answer certain questions, why institution takes their time to change. So, things like that are really central, and you bring them. I was in Ukraine last week. Again, we made some reference to the WDR. And if the WDR needs to be updated, because I hear a lot, the WDR, the situation in the world has changed so much, now we need to redo a WDR. I say no. The reason why you need to do some more work on the WDR line is because the WDR has always said that there are things they couldn't go in more detail. It's not because the situation now has made it obsolete, because I don't think it has. But those things that the WDR team said they couldn't do it, we still, to my big astonishment, haven't found the sort of funding and energy to sort of get into it and drill deeper. So I think this is really important. I'll come back to it. So now, from all those trips, maybe there's a few things that come up again and again, and I'll be a bit repetitive, but important to talk about that. The sort of importance of politics and some form of inclusive political pact. So really it brings centrally the importance of politics that as donors we'll have to ignore, because it's much more convenient, but it comes back and haunts you all the time. So that's something really important. Legitimate institution, the capacity is not the main problem. The problem is the legitimacy. And that's a very important message, especially for an organization who loves to do capacity building. Another one is the time it takes for institution to take roots. That's really important, because then you make a big mistake by feeling that you're going to get your institutional response in the year or 2 years. The phasing, we've talked about it, which is in crisis, in transition, another case. You don't do all the policies at the same time. You have to phase them. This is something we don't do, but it's very important. We should be doing it. And then the other thing, of course, very, very important, is this famous thing that it's not linear. Transition are never linear. Recovery is not very linear. Actually, among ourselves in the bank, sometimes we just do like that. WDR? and then people understand, you know. You don't have to explain really what it is, right? And I see people writing so they understand what we mean, right? Is this famous, you know, drawing that says that you will always have cycle there. And then linked to that, what has hurt a lot of countries, the stop and go with money. Right? So that's really important because it goes with this cycle. So what you need is to know how to get your program aligned to that thing. So this I think as the thing that, and then security, justice, and I would not say jobs, but I would say development, how you need to link those. So these are the facts that come always when we do, you know, a memoir and things. Now, there's a number of things that have not been said in the WDR, you know, and I think everybody says, you know, it was really a sort of transition post-conflict, but we're also a lot in the case where countries are falling apart, and now we have to intervene more in those cases. I still believe you can find a lot in the WDR to deal with those situations, but it's true that that's a different format, and in many cases we are in those type of situations. Then the sort of other issue is state. I mean, I know that many people said it was a quite state-centric still. And it's true that there are dynamic in society, ideologies, and others that are capturing the state more than they are linked to the problem of the state. And therefore, we need to look at more as those dynamic. And that's what we did actually with the fragility assessment after that by designing the methodology. We really looked to, I mean, there are problems with the state, but there are problems independent from the state, and that are very, very important in a society. But I think there are a number of things that you knew needed to be drilled more deeper. And my big question is, why haven't we done that? How can donor deal with the problem of political pact? This is a political issue. How far can we go? Is it only with the UN? It is not with the UN. There are elements of responses. I see that in West Africa, for example, and we did some research on that. Working with ECOWAS, for example, has been relatively effective because ECOWAS was effective at dealing with that. But in some other region where you don't have the same type of structure, it just does not work in this way. So how does where is the donor's influence on building political pact? And I know, you know, Annelise, I see her here, she's done a lot of work on sort of how far the bank can go in political dialogues. Another area that is really important is how do we create legitimate institution as an external donor, right? So we know that this is principally an internal process from countries, from society, but where is our support? What can we do? And that we haven't, since the WDR, I don't know anything where we've really tried to dig more into that. There's an interesting book, though, Institutions Taking Roots, that was prepared by Elizabeth Hubiens in the bank, that has given some direction, but there's not enough. I think the OECD, and all the work done around the OECD and the redefining of fragility that is also there, has also some really interesting element on some of that, on security, on institutions, and all the work done collectively by the donor now is going a little bit further. But my big question was always, how come when a book like the WDR puts a number of big questions on the table, the donors are not able to catch them and run with them into deeper research? And you know, 5 years after that, we still say, oh, it was saying WDR, they didn't drill because they couldn't do everything. Well, how come we haven't taken that, right? And the second thing that you mentioned is how come we are not, I think conflict is still a thing, you know, if you become a health specialist in the World Bank, you need to have credential, right? I still see a lot of people, and especially some of our directors or others, that take responsibility in fragile state, and they don't have to have read the WDR, they don't have to, and when you ask for them going into training, you know, you say, oh no, that's too much time, you know, it takes two days of a country director, you cannot. So that really bothers me very, very, very strongly. I think there's a body of knowledge you need to know. The WDR had brought a good part of it, and you need mandatory training on those type of things. So anyway, a few words.
Thank you very much, Alexander. Okay, just to take a few points that I got out of the four very different presentations coming from very different perspectives, but there were some very common themes. One was around the time it takes to achieve transition. The second was about the importance of coordination happening at a political level and thinking and considering issues politically. So Sarah, on the need to go beyond just the rhetoric of coordination and align resources to agreed plans. She observed that we should be better at predicting certain setbacks. We shouldn't overload the change agenda, and we should move fast on early gains. Coordination's not enough. We need joint programming on the ground. Habib saying that we can't rely on trickle down to satisfy needs and political agreements in fragile states. We need, when it happens, to expose donor hypocrisy and highlight the inconsistency of behaviour of donors against the political rhetoric at the global level. We need to cooperate at the technical level, but if there's no political cooperation, we're unlikely to achieve success. And absolutely don't preconceive development plans alone in isolation in your headquarters. I think that's excellent advice. Tom, on state formation, that it's complex, that it's painful, that it doesn't come easily. We should perhaps be concentrating more on best fit, not best practice. The development practitioners must see themselves going beyond being technicians. And that confidence should focus on processes of political settlement, not the condition or quality of the state. And then Alex imploring us not to underestimate how far and how long it takes new institutions to take root. That security and justice are always central, even if these are not things that we happen to be programming against at the time. We need to go beyond the state to get to society, and donors need to do this too, and in particular. And then raising the question about why donors haven't taken findings and directions of the WDR 2011 further into further research programs. Very useful. Thank you very much. All right, some questions. Again, if I could ask you initially to introduce yourself. One question, please, and you have a minute to ask it. And if you're addressing a particular panel member, if you could please make that clear. I'll take the first round of 3 questions. So, over here.
Erin McCandless, thank you for a great set of presentations. I really appreciated, Alexander, your last remark that was suggesting that it's security, justice, and development and not just jobs. And I'm wondering, Sarah, if Sarah and others could reflect on that. I think the Ebola crisis really illustrated this point that we cannot wait 10 years or however, to really be focusing on building the strength and inclusivity of education, health services, and others. So I'd love to hear your thoughts. Thanks.
Yes, here, please.
I guess my question to perhaps Tom and Sarah is, we've got IDA 18 coming up. What should donors be thinking about in terms of their core asks?
That sounded like 2 questions. But I'll ignore it for the time being.
Oliver Ulick from the UN Department of Peacekeeping Operations. I agree with everything that Sarah said, and 2 points that I want to connect, and I'll stay within my 1 minute, is the point you made about we were yet again too late and we did too little in CR early on. So far that hasn't hurt us as much as it could have, but I completely agree. But I think one problem connecting it to your last point on joint programming, is that again and again even if the money is there, which there's never enough, but there was quite a bit in the beginning, we actually don't have the right programming capacity to put the programs together that are of sufficient quality, even though they might be quite risky, but they need to be good enough to sell to the donors that will fund them. And again, we fall down on the ability to generate those kinds of programs with the right partners, with the right implementers on the ground. And some of that is, unfortunately, an internal UN problem, but it's not just a UN problem, if you could reflect on that.
Okay, thank you. We have the first clutch of questions in. So a couple there for Sarah. Do you want to take them together?
I'm going to go to Tom first and I'll-
Okay, yeah.
Let me just answer the IDA 18 question. I mean, I think that our general reflection on IDA 17 and prior to that is that a lot of the best work the bank has done on fragility and conflict has been with trust funds, not with IDA. And I think, if anything, we're just raising this, is that there's a real need. I think we've made it quite clear to the bank that there's a real need for there to be new leadership and new direction and to pick up a policy area, an analytical area where there's been a little bit of things haven't gone as well the last few years. So I think that's resonating. It's clearly one of our main priorities that we're raising in our IDA negotiations. I'll just leave it there.
So first on Oliver's question, I actually think this goes alongside Alexandra's point on country directors as the key issue for staffing, because we can't translate this into a reality in terms of strategy and implementation unless the main decision makers for countries, country directors from the bank's side, have the right approaches, and the main decision makers for designing innovative programs of the type that Habib talked about that we need have the right sort of grounding and training. And I do think that that's a lack on the UN side, but I actually think it's still a lack on the bank's side too. We don't have enough of what the bank calls task team leaders who are really able to do the innovative programming needing. On core asks for IDA 18, I think this needs to go from the strategies where obviously there is a big question now on the table about the definition of fragility, what should be encompassed in IDA assistance to fragility. I also think it's very important that IDA deputies are not distracted by that question away from practical implementation, because it would be nice to see some actions that relate to how the thinking is incorporated in country strategies, what tools and programming instruments are available to help, what financing instruments are available to help, and how the staffing incentives, which again Alexandra referred to, are incorporated to strengthen the bank's work in fragile situations. Erin's question very quickly on security, justice and development. I don't think we want to say all forms of development, because in a way that was the problem we were coming from. It's forms which are visible to people in building confidence and important for avoiding institutional setbacks. Jobs is often an example of that, but by no means the only example. So there are areas in education or health where that would qualify.
All right, I'll take another round of questions then. Yes, over here.
Yes, hello. Thank you very much for the very interesting overview. I'm Katrina Hild from GIZ here for the German Ministry of Economic Cooperation and Development. And I would be very interested to see, talking about inclusive and legitimate institutions, it's really relevant for our governance sectors, and it is high on the agenda on the peace and conflict agendas, but how can we also see how to better reach out to other sectors? I think is maybe SDG giving us an impetus to see how we can use the governance sector as an enabler for other SDGs, and how we can reach out to the other sectors, and what would be good ideas for it, because I think in our communities it's quite there, but we need to reach out, as you said, just education, health, whatever.
Can you hear? Come sit here. Thank you. Good afternoon. Andrea Koppel with the Global Humanitarian and Development Organization, Mercy Corps. My question has to do with what it will take to get the World Bank and other donors to start thinking more methodically and systemically about the way that programs themselves are designed. And by that I mean, we can say all we want about the importance of programming to context in fragile states and amidst conflict. But unless the programs themselves are adaptable, so that they would incorporate adaptive management, that they would have the flexibility to pivot and iterate over the course of the life cycle of the program, that they would have a longer life cycle, I think that we're not going to really be able to gather the kind of evidence and data that we need that shows what works. So I guess my question is, how do we get that into your boilerplate talking points as part of what's needed in these complex environments? Thank you.
Okay, one more. Yes.
Marcus Lenson, Senior Conflict Advisor for DFID. I want to echo briefly how much I've used the WDR 2011 in my work in all sorts of forms and shapes. So I do think it has had long legs, which is very good. Since there was a lot of criticism on what donors haven't taken forward, of course I can't help but say DFID in particular has invested a lot in research in a number of the areas that the WDR said we needed more work, and I'm quite pleased that quite a few of the research consortia we're funding are actually here at the forum and presenting a number of their findings that are now slowly starting to come out, particularly on security and justice and hybrid forms of governance, thinking about public authority in different ways and the linkages between state legitimacy and service delivery and the kind of perhaps too easy assumptions we've sometimes made about that and what that means for other sectors of work, and not assuming too easily that just by getting, let's say, certain types of service delivery basically has done that, that automatically translates into better state legitimacy. That perhaps sometimes was a too easy assumption. I think I would like to go with a question back on the jobs thing. One thing that I've seen that was unfortunately problematic, and we tried always to hold against it, that people took headline messages away: security, justice, jobs. Those who only read, 1 or 2 pages of the document said, right, let's do a jobs program, and then we will be contributing to stability.
Got 10 seconds, Marcus.
And we often try to say, no, that's not what it meant, longer time is. But currently we're trying a lot to do more with the economic growth colleagues of like, what else, how can you think about economic growth strategies that contribute to stability and do no harm, that goes beyond just jobs? If you've got any more points on that, would be great.
Okay, thank you. So first question from Katrina about how to go beyond governance, security, law and justice to the other sectors and SDGs. I wonder whether, Habib, you might have the first go at that.
I would also, if you allow me, quickly reflect on the second one as well. Also, the second. First of all, on governance, one of the problems I think that we have seen is that these pieces are taken as standalone projects. For example, if you're talking about supporting the governance as an enabler for the overall development to take place, we take it as a standalone projects without considering the political aspect of the governance as well, and also the context, which is very much important. That is, from the recipient perspective that we have seen it. And also, secondly, on what it will take, I'm not expert in, I've not worked, I'm not privileged to work in the World Bank or in the UN, but what will it take to transform ourselves? I think I will go back to my original point, is that get rid of the blueprints that you have here. That is the only solution I think that we see. If you make yourself adaptable and flexible and go and take some risk there and work in the countries and don't apply the common standards, because countries, their situations, their legacies, the history of the conflicts, all of them are different. And be quick in terms of responding, but not in terms of living. This is, we have experienced it in Somalia, for example. We are experiencing in Central African Republic. There's a government. That government needs a quick, type of support to be available so that they can ensure service delivery and they can maintain their legitimacy. If you are waiting for, things to happen, I think that will be too late. Thank you.
Let me respond to the question, I believe it was from Andrea from Mercy Corps. Excellent point, and I would point you to look at all of the recent, or many of the recent requests for proposals that have come out from DFAT for programs in fragile states recently. And you'll see that words like thinking, working politically, flexible, iterative programming are peppered throughout these documents. We have absolutely taken that point to heart, and I'll admit that in many ways it's easier for bilateral donors to do that than multilateral donors, particularly for lending operations. But we, as a medium-sized donor, have really tried to enable partners to work in much more flexible, much more politically informed ways. And in a lot of cases have worked with other donors to try to create platforms like this Joint Peace Fund in Myanmar that I mentioned that are incredibly flexible, and that actually the decision-making process is deferred until the implementation stage, right? So I think there's been a lot of progress on that element, but it's mixed between different donors, I would say. Thanks.
So two things. The one that I want to say is about the instruments. I still believe we have a serious problem with instruments. I completely agree. I mean, actually in CR, the first time we've been able to be flexible on the immediate request, but you know, again, Mali Northern Emergency took a year to prepare. It's difficult to explain why we are not being able to work there, but I think it's really important. On the economic growth, I fully agree. I think what we need now is to try to see how how development programs in the deeper are actually contributing to stability in a broader sense, right? So it's not only about employment. How do I get my economy restart with an impact quickly enough and well enough in certain situations? So I would completely agree that that's the way to go about it. And I don't know whether you have an answer. Don't have a great answer to that, but I think this is something we're trying to think about.
Let me just comment something on the first question about linkages, that there is now a great opportunity because of the SDG framework to relook at linkages. I think it will be very important for the achievement of SDG 16 to look not only at the targets that are within that goal, but also the linkage from other goals. This would be a great time to do that before we get too far into implementation without actually really understanding what the linkages are.
Okay, I was going to ask Marcus, before you go, are you happy that we've addressed economic growth?
I'm happy that we've got a new agenda to work on together, so I'll look forward to that later.
All right, we have gone already 12 minutes over time, but we started a little bit late. With the indulgence of the panel members, I might take one or two more very quick questions. Of course. Might take one or two very quick questions more before we let people out for lunch.
Okay, James Cox from the Civil Society Platform for Peace Building and State Building. There's a Far Side cartoon with a general leaning back saying, "What if we had a war and everybody came?" And he's looking very happy about it. But I'm kind of terrified that as fragile and complex settings come more and more to the centre of development, it's not going to be this little niche that we have here, but it's going to be everyone coming along when wanting to do it. And this is a challenge to us because, one, yay, but two, it means that what we've been hearing today about, sort of picking where we can actually, have, not working on too many fronts, finding those ways that we can build confidence is going to be directly challenged by the fact that everyone will be wanting to be there doing the things that they want to do. And we can talk about aid alignment and so on, but there's going to be a lot more to align. And I'm just wondering if this is something that we need to be starting to think about. Thank you.
I can tell you I think about it a lot. I'm not sure I got any answers.
Yeah, I'm Emmanuel Fiadro from the World Bank. I've been wondering on the issue of innovation and programming, right? And also looking for instruments and what have you. I know, Sarah, you've all worked on GMAP for Liberia, and there's this issue about CAR, what can be done. Looking forward, is there things that we can learn from the GMAP and probably replicate in CAR, for instance?
Thank you. Tom will probably want to have a go at the first question.
Well, I think that was a rhetorical question, right? I mean, as we've seen in Myanmar, there was, and this is a country where I've had more recent experience, there was an influx of people, and then a lot of organizations just didn't get traction. They couldn't get meetings. And there's actually been a weeding out of that. Now, it would have been better if we could have all been more collectively joined up from the beginning, but I think that the joining up is now happening to a large extent. Yes, I think that we could handle these things more strategically. My view is that there needs to be a little bit more empowerment of those who are kind of the keepers of this discipline, right? To rein in other programs that are actually going over the lines or making problems. It's inevitable that in transition moments there's going to be a lot of new actors. But finding a way to say, to this education project or that infrastructure project, no, that's going to be really, really problematic. Right now, I don't think there's enough mechanisms to rein those people in, and that's partly about different sectors, the divisions within, say, the World Bank or other donors. But I think there's some work to be done there. But I think that problem it's almost inevitable. There's going to be an influx.
Yeah, thanks, Tom. I might just get Habib to respond.
Just very quickly, in 10 seconds maybe on the question James raised, which is very, very relevant. What I would say is that, if we can unite ourselves on the purpose of our engagement, I think we can address that question of fragmentation in our actors. And one positive trend that I see, again, I'm naive, I don't know what's happening in reality, is this collaboration between, like the UN and the World Bank on some of the cases. And here we can bring all those factors together, and then we can agree that we can also identify the linkages of politics, economic and governance and all the other issues. So I think this is a positive trend, I would say. I mean, we have to keep that up. Thank you.
Always nice to end with some optimism. Sarah, on both of those questions, I think you probably have something to say.
So the second question, which Emmanuel asked, was about the Governance and Economic Management Action Programme in Liberia, which was a programme of bringing in regional skills, basically to co-oversee with the Liberians their key public finance decisions. It was put in place in a situation of very, very high corruption in Liberia in the period leading up to the 2004 election. I think that there are lessons from it. I actually think that Somalia has managed to put in place a mechanism which has avoided some of the issues that were in Liberia. I would say what you always want to do with that type of mechanism is make sure it's rooted in some domestic demand in the country for that kind of oversight, and that it's not just seen as an international imposition. On the reining people in when there are too many of us and everyone is coming to the party, one of the really key things here is to talk to those who will be the national leadership, who will be the national counterparts, early. And if we look at conflicts in the Middle East now, for instance, it's not really clear to me that there is a sustained engagement with some of the parties who might emerge eventually as part of a settlement. Because in the end, if they understand early on how they might interact with the international community, they will be more successful at reining us in than any one individual international institution will be.
All right. Thank you, everyone, for a very stimulating exchange. And would you help me, please, thank our distinguished panel. And thank you again for attending.